She was born Norma Jeane Mortenson on June 1, 1926, in the charity ward of Los Angeles General Hospital. Her mother listed the father as unknown. This was not entirely true, but truth was a luxury that Gladys Pearl Baker could rarely afford, and she was spending what little she had on other things entirely. The baby was beautiful. People always commented on that, and the comments always had a strange quality, something between admiration and unease, as though beauty in a child born into those circumstances was almost an insult, almost a cruelty visited upon the child herself. What would the world do with this beauty? What would the world want from it? We know the answer now. We have always known the answer. The world would take everything it could and give back almost nothing. The world would worship the surface and ignore the person underneath. The world would decide what she was before she ever had the chance to decide for herself. But in the beginning, before the world got its hands on her, she was just a little girl who did not know where she belonged. That is where the story really starts. Not with the white dress or the subway grate or the whispered presidential birthday or the empty bottles of Nembutal. It starts here, in a charity ward, with a beautiful baby nobody was quite ready for and a mother who was already, even then, beginning to come apart at the seams. Gladys Pearl Baker was what they called, in those careful, clinical days, nervous. She was, in truth, suffering from something that today we would recognize and name and treat with a great deal more compassion and effectiveness. A serious mental illness that swept through her life like weather, arriving without warning, leaving damage in its wake, retreating just long enough to allow hope to form before returning to destroy it. She had already lost custody of 2 children from her first marriage, a boy and a girl who were raised by their father and largely disappeared from her life. Norma Jeane was her attempt at something new. At something that might work. At a life that might hold together this time. The attempt lasted almost exactly 3 years. For those 3 years, Gladys Baker worked as a film cutter at RKO Studios. Skilled work, detail work, the kind of work that requires a steady hand and a focused mind, and she was capable of both when she was well. She did not live with her daughter in those early years. She could not manage it. Norma Jeane was placed with a couple named Ida and Wayne Bolander in the town of Hawthorne, California, who fostered children for the modest payment the county provided. Gladys visited on weekends when she could. Sometimes she could not. The Bolanders were not cruel people. This is important to say, because the temptation, in any story about Marilyn Monroe's childhood, is to populate it with villains, to explain the woman's difficulties by pointing to specific acts of specific monsters. The reality is more ordinary and therefore more disturbing. The Bolanders were strict. They were religious in the particular way of people for whom religion is primarily a set of prohibitions. They ran their household with the calm, unyielding certainty of those who believe that order, maintained at all costs, is the same thing as goodness. They were not warm. They fed her, clothed her, sent her to church 3 times a week, and gave her absolutely nothing that could be mistaken for tenderness. Norma Jeane was not an easy child to be unloving toward. She was responsive, eager, hungry for connection in the transparent way of children who have not yet learned to hide their hunger. She laughed easily. She asked questions constantly. She noticed things, colors, sounds, the expressions on people's faces, with a sensitivity that the Bolanders found excessive and that would later, reframed by the world's desire for her, be called luminous and magnetic and star quality. As a child, it was just inconvenient. Too much feeling in a household that had decided feeling was a problem to be managed. She had a dog. His name was Tippy, and she loved him with the complete, uncomplicated devotion that children give to animals when humans have proved unreliable. Tippy did not leave. Tippy did not have episodes. Tippy did not visit on weekends when he could manage it and disappear when he couldn't. Tippy was simply there, warm and present and asking nothing of her except what she was most naturally inclined to give: affection, attention, the simple animal comfort of company. A neighbor shot the dog. He said it had gotten into his yard. Norma Jeane was 7 years old. She did not cry in front of anyone. She had already learned, by 7, that her grief made other people uncomfortable, and that when people were uncomfortable they became distant, and that distance, for a child with no fixed home and no guaranteed love, was the most terrifying thing in the world. So she was quiet. She put the grief somewhere inside herself, in the place where she was learning to put all the things that were too large or too painful for the available space of her life, and she carried it there, and she smiled, and people found the smile beautiful. She was learning, in other words, to be Marilyn Monroe. Decades before anyone called her that. In a small house in Hawthorne, California, a little girl with no father and a mother she barely saw and a dead dog she was not allowed to mourn properly was developing, out of absolute necessity, the tool she would use for the rest of her life. The smile that wasn't the whole story. The performance that concealed the person. The extraordinary surface that made people stop looking at anything beneath it. Gladys Baker tried, periodically, to have her daughter back. There was a period in 1933, when Norma Jeane was 7, when Gladys had saved enough money and was holding herself together with both hands and had rented a small house in Hollywood and furnished it with the careful, excited attention of someone who has never been allowed to own beautiful things and is finally, briefly, being given the chance. She bought a piano. White, upright, second-hand but polished. She played it in the evenings. In the photographs from that period, and there are a few, creased and faded now, reproduced in biographies, Gladys Baker looks almost well. Almost like someone who might make it. Norma Jeane remembered that piano for the rest of her life. Marilyn Monroe talked about it in sessions with her psychiatrist Dr. Ralph Greenson, 25 years later, with a specificity that suggested the memory had never faded. The sound of it, the way the light fell on the keys in the afternoon, the evenings when her mother played and the house was briefly, improbably, something close to a home. She said it was the happiest she had ever been as a child. She said it lasted about 8 months. Then the weather changed. Gladys Baker was hospitalized in January of 1935. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She was committed to Norwalk State Hospital. She would spend the next several decades moving in and out of institutions, each stay longer than the last, each release more fragile and more brief. The piano was repossessed. Norma Jeane went back into the system. The woman who took her next was Grace McKee Goddard, Gladys's best friend, a vibrant, somewhat theatrical woman who worked at the same film studio and who had always been fond of the little girl and who now, finding herself suddenly and unexpectedly responsible for a 7-year-old with no legal guardian and no stable home, did her best. Grace's best was genuinely given. It was also, practically speaking, insufficient. She had her own life, her own complications, a relationship with a man named Doc Goddard that was about to become a marriage. She could not simply absorb a child into her life without disruption. But she loved Norma Jeane. And she told her things. She took her to the movies. They went often, Grace and the little girl, sitting in the dark watching the silver screen, and Grace would lean over in the darkness and say things that burrowed into Norma Jeane's mind and set up permanent residence there. "You're going to be beautiful," she said. "More beautiful than any of them. You could be like Jean Harlow someday. You could be a movie star." She meant it as comfort. She meant it as a gift, an offering of possibility, a way of saying, "Your life does not have to be what it has been so far." She could not have known what she was doing. She could not have known that she was handing a frightened, rootless child a blueprint, not for happiness, not for security, not for the ordinary kinds of love that rootless children most desperately need, but for a specific, particular, ultimately insufficient substitute, fame. The world's attention as a replacement for the love that had never been reliably present. Norma Jeane heard it differently than Grace intended. She heard, if you become something the world wants badly enough, the world cannot leave you. If enough people know your face, need your face, reach toward your face in the darkness of a movie theater, then perhaps you will never again be the child waiting to be moved to the next place, the child for whom no place is permanent, the child who has understood, with the devastating clarity of the very young, that she is not anyone's first priority. She filed it away. She was, by then, extremely good at filing things away. The orphanage came next, in 1935, when she was 9 years old. Not because she was an orphan. Her mother was alive, hospitalized but alive, and the fact of the mother's survival was something Norma Jeane would insist on, would repeat, would need the world to understand, for the rest of her life. She was not abandoned. She was not unwanted. She was simply, and the simpleness of it was its own particular cruelty, not able to be cared for by the people who should have cared for her. the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society on El Centro Avenue in Hollywood. She arrived there with a small suitcase and the careful composure she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that composure was what was expected of her. A woman who worked at the orphanage in those years, interviewed decades later when she was in her late 80s, described the 9-year-old Norma Jeane as the best-behaved child she had ever seen in that place. Quiet, helpful, never any trouble, always the first to volunteer for extra chores, always the last to complain. The saddest child she had ever seen, the woman added. Sad in that particular way of children who have stopped expecting things to get better. Not hopeless exactly. Not broken. Just very still, in the way of someone who has learned that stillness is the safest position. She washed dishes. She earned 10 cents a week. She went to school. She was, in the way that children are, making the best of it. Making the absolute best of something that should not have been happening to her at all. Grace Goddard did not abandon her. She visited. She brought things. She advocated, in the ways available to her, for Norma Jeane's welfare. And in 1937, after a period of particularly sustained effort, she managed to arrange for the girl to leave the orphanage and live with a woman named Anna Lower, Grace's aunt, who was in her mid-60s, a Christian Scientist, and possessed of a quality that had been almost entirely absent from Norma Jeane's life up to that point: genuine, uncomplicated warmth. Anna Lower. This woman does not get enough credit in the story of Marilyn Monroe. She is a footnote, a minor character, easily overlooked in the drama of what came after. But Norma Jeane herself, interviewed many times across many years, spoke of Aunt Anna with a consistent, quiet reverence that spoke volumes. She was kind, Norma Jeane said. She was just kind. She didn't want anything from me. She just loved me. She just loved me. For words that illuminate everything, that tell you more about the shape of Norma Jeane Mortenson's childhood than any clinical summary or biographical timeline. Love that didn't want anything. Love that wasn't conditional on performance or beauty or good behavior or the management of other people's discomfort. Love that was simply there. Norma Jeane lived with Anna Lower for nearly 3 years, the longest continuous period of stability she had known since the brief, doomed happiness of the house with the piano. She went to school in Compton. She made friends. She began, cautiously, to emerge from the stillness she had wrapped around herself. She laughed. She was, by accounts of people who knew her then, a normal, vivid, funny girl who happened to have an extraordinary face and a history she carried carefully, never putting it down but learning, gradually, to carry it without showing how heavy it was. Then Grace Goddard's husband got a job transfer to West Virginia. Grace could not take Norma Jeane with her. The options were the orphanage again, or a marriage. She was 15 years old. James Doherty was 21, a neighbor's son, a decent young man who liked the girl and was willing to marry her and who understood, in the practical way of people living practical lives, that this was a solution to a problem and not a grand romance. The marriage was arranged by Grace with the sincere, misguided belief that she was doing the best thing for a girl who needed security above all else. She probably was doing the best available thing. The best available thing was still a 15-year-old girl being married off because nobody knew what else to do with her. Norma Jeane married Jim Doherty on June 19, 1942. She was 16 years and 18 days old. She wore a white dress borrowed from a neighbor. In the photograph she looks like what she was, a child being asked to be an adult, a child being told that this house, this man, this ordinary domestic life in Van Nuys, was the destination, was the answer to the question of what happened to girls like her. She was not miserable, not at first. Doherty was kind. The house was hers. She cooked, cleaned, kept things orderly, found a satisfaction in the simple daily work of maintaining a home that she had never been allowed to maintain before. She adopted a collie dog. She went to the market. She came home. She was safe, in the limited but real way that safety means the absence of threat. But she was also Norma Jeane Mortenson, who had been told in a darkened movie theater that she could be like Jean Harlow. She was also a young woman with a mind that kept reaching past the edges of Van Nuys, past the edges of the life that had been arranged to contain her. She read constantly, novels, magazines, anything she could find. She thought. She watched the world with the same intense, noticing quality she had always had, and the world, even the limited world of wartime suburban California, kept offering her things to notice. When the photographer David Conover arrived at the radio plane munitions factory where she had gone to work while Doherty was away with the merchant marine, and pointed his camera at her, something in her recognized the moment. Something woke up that had been waiting, patiently, since Grace Goddard leaned over in the dark theater and offered it a reason to wait. The camera was a kind of attention. Not the temporary, conditional attention of people who needed things from you. The permanent, unconditional attention of the lens. The possibility of being seen in a way that could not be taken back. She signed with the Blue Book Modeling Agency in August of 1945. She was 19 years old. She began the long, deliberate, intensely focused process of making herself into what she needed to become. She dyed her hair. She practiced her walk. She studied the women on magazine covers and understood, with the analytical precision of someone who has spent her whole life observing the conditions of survival, exactly what the camera wanted and how to give it. The marriage to Doherty ended in 1946. He did not want a wife who was becoming something other than what he had married. She did not want to stop becoming. The divorce was quiet, uncomplicated, without rancour on either side. She kept the dog. Norma Jeane Mortenson signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox in 1946. She was paid $125 a week. She was 20 years old. The studio renamed her. She chose the surname Monroe herself, after her maternal grandmother, the grandmother she had never known, whose name was the only inheritance she had ever received from the maternal line of her family. They gave her Marilyn from a list of first names that sounded good with Monroe. She became Marilyn Monroe on a piece of paper in a studio office. Norma Jeane Mortenson did not disappear. She never disappeared. She was always there, inside the construction, the little girl from the orphanage who washed dishes for a dime a week and kept her grief too quiet for anyone to hear and loved a dog named Tippy and understood loss before she understood almost anything else. Every person who knew Marilyn Monroe well speaks of this duality, the performance and the person, the surface and the depth, the Marilyn who existed for the world and the Norma Jeane who existed only when the cameras were away and the door was closed and someone she trusted was present. Lee and Paula Strasberg saw her as both. Arthur Miller fell in love with the Norma Jeane and spent their marriage struggling with the Marilyn. Ralph Roberts, her masseur and friend, was one of the few people she trusted enough to let the seam show. She never stopped being the child who had been told she was not wanted. She never stopped being afraid of abandonment. She never stopped doing the calculation, somewhere in the back of her mind, between what she could offer and what she might receive in return, between the performance of herself and the safety that performance was supposed to guarantee. And she never stopped reaching for the thing that Anna Lower had given her for 3 years in Compton. Love that didn't want anything. Love that was just there. Love that she had spent the rest of her life looking for in rooms full of people who were dazzled by what she appeared to be and largely indifferent to who she actually was. She almost found it, a few times. She found pieces of it. She found it in books, sometimes, and in the unexpected conversations she had with people who were surprised to discover that she was reading Dostoevsky and had opinions about it. She found it in her work, in the pure absorbed concentration of becoming a character, of disappearing into something larger than herself. She found it occasionally in the analytic sessions with Dr. Greensun that were supposed to help her, and that helped her, partially, imperfectly, in the way that help always comes to people who needed it much earlier. But she never found it completely. Because what Norma Jeane Mortenson needed had been missing since the very beginning, since the charity ward at Los Angeles General Hospital, since the Bolanders' house in Hawthorne, since the orphanage on El Centro Avenue with the 10 cents a week and the careful, aching composure of a child who has decided not to ask for what she knows she cannot have. She became the most famous woman in the world. She became an icon, a symbol, a face that 60 years after her death is still instantly recognizable on every continent on Earth. She became Marilyn Monroe, the thing that Grace McKee Goddard promised in a darkened movie theater to a frightened child who needed something to hold on to. And she remained, until the end, also Norma Jeane. Watching from the window, carrying the grief quietly, waiting for someone to look past the extraordinary surface and see the person who had always been there underneath. Nobody knew her real name. Very few people, in her lifetime, knew her real face. We are still learning to see it. We are still learning what it means that a girl with that beginning made something that extraordinary out of the material she was given. Still learning what it costs, what it takes, what it demands of a person, to survive a childhood like that and come out the other side still reaching, still curious, still wanting, still unbroken in the place that matters most, even as everything else was breaking. Her real name was Norma Jeane. She was born in a charity ward on June 1, 1926. She was nobody's first priority for most of her early life, and she turned that into the thing that made her unforgettable. That is not a sad story. Or rather, it is a sad story, but it is also something more than sad. It is the story of a person who refused, at every stage, to be only what her circumstances said she could be. Who reached for more, always, even when reaching hurt. Who made herself out of almost nothing and became, in the making, something the world is still not done understanding. Norma Jeane. Born June 1, 1926. Died August 4, 1962. In between, a life that contained more than the world was ever able to hold properly, and more love, given and sought and given again, than any one person should have had to carry alone.